Hi everyone, we are gonna wait a few more minutes until we have more people in the webinar.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first international webinar organized by the Institute of Research in Ecology and Conservation, IIECCO, by this Spanish acronym. I am Victor Sanchez, co-founder of IIECCO. IIECCO is a Peruvian not-profit organization that promotes the scientific research as a tool in the conservation of natural resources. We invite you to learn more about us at IIECCO.org. Today, I have the pleasure to introducing you to Kate Goodenough, whom I met a few years ago when she was studying Skimmers Migration in Manu. Being able to work with her inspired me to be a better professional and open up a world of opportunities for my career. I hope that today she can inspire you as well. Now, before to starting, there's some things to make in account. Please turn off your microphones during the talk. You can write your questions. You can write your questions in the chat in English or Spanish, and in the end, we will read. We will read them once we finish reading the questions in the chat. You can ask turn off turn on your microphones if you have more questions. Thank you, Kate. You can start if you are ready.
All right. So let me start my video. So to warn everyone, I usually have technical difficulties, and this is my first webinar. So if things are a little wacky at first, it's my karma that's showing itself. So let me see if I can start.
Yeah, You can start
You
sharing
see?
your.
Oh, you're right. I forgot to start sharing it. Hold on. I was like sharing the other, not that. Like I said. Let's see. Ah, present now, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sharing a window. There we go. All right. There we go. And we'll start. So I thought I'd go ahead and talk a little bit about myself and kind of introduce myself before I got into the the specifics around Peru and the research that I do down in the Peruvian Amazon. And so for me, I kind of like have this philosophy of like my biggest question in this whole realm of ecology and evolution is understanding how birds are capable of responding to environmental variation, because I think that only in which we can understand how they respond to environmental variation is how we're going to be able to predict how they may respond to the future, given that we've got climate change issues, as well as anthropogenic activities that are impacting populations worldwide. So a little bit about me. I have been studying Charateriiformes, which is just basically colored sandpipers, shorebirds for probably over 15 years now. And really and truly, I've started in the coastal environment. So I'm actually a trained marine biologist. And so I really don't have very much tropical experience. So when I came to Manu, I had this idea of like, I knew what ground nesting species, what I thought I knew ground nesting species were supposed to be like. And of course, since being in Manu, it has really opened up a new avenue of looking at how ground nesting birds like kind of respond to environmental variation. I kind of take a piece of the book of Dr. Terborg, who actually has been in Manu and actually ran Coach Cashew biological station since the early 60s, I guess. And the fact that understanding bird changes in bird behavior kind of starts when we can go to a system that is completely, clean of human impacts. And that's really hard to do. As a coastal biologist, it's extremely hard to do because urban development is just massive, on a massive scale, and confounds a lot of the results that we can get about disturbance for birds. And so I thought, well, maybe going to Manu, this would be an avenue in which I can look at natural bird behavior and bird responses. So if you guys are interested in more about like what I'm doing, because I do more than just work in Manu, you can check out my website, which is lairdresearch.com. All right. So again, like I said, my interest has been researching life history parameters of terns and their allies, and typically that's on the coastal environment. And typically, yeah.
We cannot see your presentation.
Oh no. Well, here I am going on and on. Okay, wait a minute. That's okay. So I'm wondering what I'm doing wrong. So are you seeing it now?
No.
Okay. See, I told you there's going to be some technical difficulties.
Yeah, sometimes.
All right, so let's see. What am I doing?
Share a window. Share just a window.
Are you sharing a window? Do you see that?
Nope, not yet.
It says it's sharing my window, so I'm wondering.
Yeah. And you must be selected and click on it.
I did.
And
all right, I'm gonna stop sharing again, and let me try that again.
Okay.
Error occurred when it's telling me an error occurred when okay, let me try it again. Okay.
That's it.
How about
that
now?
is working now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Victor. See, I told you guys, this is how it goes for me. I always have technical difficulties in the beginning.
Don't worry, it's okay.
All right. And Victor, butt in if it doesn't work. It's if it starts not working. So can you see it now?
Yeah, yes, it's working.
All right, so I'm not going to rehash what I just said, but basically, this is kind of my philosophy on, understanding the capability of birds responding to environmental variation, and it's really important in context of climate-driven change and anthropogenic changes. So I'm just going to scooch on beyond this next slide. So again, like I said, researching life history parameters of terns and allies has been something I've been doing for probably for sure the last 10 years, but I've been interested in it for the last 14 years. And it's kind of like a detective novel. It's very complicated because there's so many influences that could be, affecting how birds respond. And the interesting thing about terns and their allies is that most of them are very long-lived species. So you can have the skimmer, our black skimmer, which actually can reach to be 25 years of age or older. We have royal terns along the coast that have actually been documented to be 31 or older. And even some of our smaller species, like the least tern, which is similar to the Chilean tern, has been documented to be 23 years of age. And so when it comes to species with long generations time, it's really difficult to find these micro-adaptations that might be occurring via evolution. So we have to look at it from a behavioral standpoint. How much behavioral plasticity these birds have to be able to respond to environmental variation? And that's kind of where my interest lies. And like I said, I'm more of a marine biologist with very little tropical experience, but over the last few years, it's been a game changer. I look at things a lot differently because the whole idea of having inland introgression, where birds that you typically would find on the coast are actually nesting inland, it's one of those things of like, well, why? And there's got to be trade-offs, and what are those trade-offs? And for, especially looking at life history parameters. So I'm just going to kind of twist it over to talking about the Amazon basin. So for those of you who are not all that familiar with Amazon, so those of you who are from, Peru and South America, please, just give me a chance here to just kind of explain a little bit about the Amazon basin, and then we'll get into the better stuff about Manu. So the cool thing about the Amazon basin, it has the highest degree of biodiversity in the world. And it is the largest source of fresh water in the world, accounting for up to 20% of the global freshwater water supply. And obviously, we all know it is large. It's greater than 40% of the South American continent. And there's extreme variation in flood events across the Amazon basin because it crosses the equator. So such that flooding events that happen north of the equator actually happen 6 months ahead of what happens south of the equator. And this counts for, like I said, extreme variation, and also actually adds and influences to the endemicity of many bird species that can only be found in the Amazon basin. And of course, for my bird friends, there are well over 1,000 species of birds in the Amazon basin. So it's a pretty spectacular place. So when it comes to basin precipitation water cycles, it's pretty much warm year-round with temperatures ranging about 22 to 34 degrees Celsius. It has a typical wet, dry season. So the wet season is typically November through April, and then you have a little transition zone, and then you have the dry season, which we all figure starts in June, and then it transitions through October back to the wet season. So it has heavy rainfall, up to 500 inches annually. And the cool thing about the Amazon rainforest, at least I think it's pretty cool, is that it's responsible for creating up to 50% of its own precipitation. When you think about that, it's pretty neat, but it's also pretty wet. And the other thing too about this, the Amazon basin, especially the Peruvian Amazon, is it has pulsed hydrology. And what that means is that it not only does it have a wet dry season, but it also has precipitation during the dry season that can then create these temporary flood pulses, which are often caused by friajes. And if any of you have been anywhere near the Amazon during a friaje, you know how radical the temperature switches can be. And it's a very interesting cycle. The cool thing is that all of these little pieces of the puzzle kind of mix together to create a highly disturbed, but very cyclic and therefore predictable breeding habitat for those species that can use it. So like I said, the dry season is May through October, which is, the austral winter, and it is the period of low water with only 5% of the total rainfall. So you think about 5% of 500 inches. It's still a lot, but it's not as much as during the wet season. And this dry season, with the lack of that extra water, it concentrates and it lowers the river down such that it concentrates food resources. And it also exposes mudflats and river playas for water birds and turtles nesting, and obviously provides a rest areas for caiman, which we often see that like to hang out in sun on the beaches as we go by on the boats. So some of the big threats for the Amazon rainforest are obviously, I think everyone knows about the biodiversity loss due to deforestation. I think that's the big key there. But we also have to worry about mercury contamination due to artisanal gold mining, and the last but not least, the hydroelectric development that's proposed for several of the main tributaries for the Amazon in both Peru and in Brazil. So just a piece of information on this that I thought I'd show everybody. And this is actually several years old. Is that there's greater than 200 hydroelectric projects planned in development for the Amazon. And you'll see the little red star, which is the approximate location of Cashew and Manu. And you can see that there are a whole lot of projects that have been proposed, and as well as some projects that are existing or near completion. And at this point, they may be near completion. So this makes it really important to try and understand the connection between river hydrology and waterbird nesting, because there has been very little waterbird research, especially intra and intertropical movements of waterbirds. And so we really don't have a baseline understanding of what would happen if we get these hydroelectric developments going on. We don't know what would happen to the birds. We don't understand how it would impact the rivers and the river beaches, and therefore nesting, ground nesting bird success. But we can kind of take a look at what's happened in China and other parts of Asia to really understand that, yeah, there's potential for serious impacts to the Amazon through these hydroelectric developments. All right, so excuse me, I need to drink water there. So chronology of waterbird research in Manu. So like I mentioned, there's been very little tropical waterbird research. And so as in reference to that, there's been a few more studies than in other places for Manu. Groom started a sand-colored nighthawk parasitation project looking at how sand-colored nighthawks were influencing the reproductive success of skimmers and terns and Manu. And that happened in the late 90s. And then Dr. Davenport came in and started tracking Orinoco geese right around 2008 or so. And she's been doing that pretty consistently the last few years. Then in 2014, we started our project, satellite tracking skimmers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then 2015, we had Martin Ostad from Norway do his thesis on black skimmer nesting phenology at Manu. And then after that, I came back. I decided that I was going to do a chapter for my doctoral thesis, and I wanted to look at monitoring movements of the skimmer population and terns using mark recapture techniques, and then also looking more specifically at nest site selection research. All right, so for those of you, this is the study location for our site in Manu National Park. And it's about a 47-kilometer range that goes about 4 kilometers north of, or upriver of Cashew Biological Station. And it extends downriver to where the Rio Pinquén meets up with the Rio Manu, which is just I don't know, it's just a bit of a distance away from Limanol. So if you get a kind of an idea, it's a pretty wide stretch of the Manu. So as I mentioned earlier, we started an initial tracking project with Skimmers in 2014. And that was done with my collaborators, Dr. Davenport and Dr. Haugesson from Norway. And it was a great experience to try and understand, you know, like just the beginning of what was going on with like even understanding. For me, it blows my mind that skimmers are actually in the inland and they live it, or that they're nesting on these inland rivers, because, you know, I've always thought that skimmers are coastal species. So this just really, I actually went down in 2014 as a present for getting my master's finished. So this just was one of those unique coincidences that turned out to be something better, or, you know, just as has improved with time. So with the movement research, with the telemetry results, what we found is that the skimmers have a very diverse migration strategy. So we documented individuals that went to the Peruvian coastline. The individual went to Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia. And those individuals that, you know, went to the Peruvian coastline, they didn't just stop. Some of them stopped at Paracas, but some of them went all the way south and actually wintered or spent the non-breeding season in southern Chile, which was pretty radical for us, because we, you know, I think this piece of information, I mean, it's just, I don't think, we would compare this to something like the finding out about bar-headed geese crossing the Himalayas, because not only did they cross, which you don't think it's not a very big distance, it's only about like 600 kilometers from, you know, Cashew or Manu National Park to the coastline, but they have to cross the Andean Cordillera, which is upwards of, you know, in some points 5,000 meters above sea level. And we were tracking individuals that were flying high altitudes, and this is unusual because we would never have expected it from this species. You know, skimmers have a very interesting, you know, foraging ecology that we really thought would drive them, that they would be just lowland species and they probably would never cross the mountains. So we were proven wrong on that aspect. And also, you know, just, you know, the diversity of migration from these birds is just incredible. But in addition to that, you know, I was thinking about it as I, you know, continued on with the research. I was like, yeah, okay, so maybe some individuals, maybe a small portion of individuals cross to Peru. But I don't know, you know, we don't know how much of that population is really there. So I went ahead and we started doing banding, using unique field readables for skimmers. And we did that starting with Martin in 2016 through 2018. And what we found was that there was a pretty good majority of skimmers that are in Manu that were recited in Paracas. And also that it was not only just adults, but also juveniles. And to extend that further, we have had banded adults also documented in Chile and Brazil. All right. So I want to make sure I'm still with you. I heard a little ding, and I wanted to make sure that we're not. Okay. Yeah, I just heard a ding, so I just wanted to make sure I didn't lose you guys.
Yeah.
All right. So aside from the research movement, you know, migration for these birds, we also found a lot of other cool things out with this telemetry data. And one of the big things for us is that, you know, we had close to 800 documented locations, and 92% of them were documented to be no more than 5 kilometers from a river tributary. So it was very obvious that skimmers use the river tributaries as a way to move and navigate within the Amazon. And, you know, this has been supported with information from tracking of birds in Brazil, where the skimmers are also using river tributaries to come to Manu and then cross in the same areas that our skimmers have to get to the coastline. So it's been pretty cool. But I'll leave that to Dr. Davenport because, I think she's working on that manuscript right now. But we also documented that there's regional movements of up to 760 kilometers one way with these birds. And so we're like, why would they travel so far away? And I think it's a strategy for them to be able to leave when the river floods, and then go check out other resources along the river, and then come back when the river levels come lower, so that they can go back to nesting. So it's just for them, it's a secondary nest site selecting. So in regards to like banded terns and skimmers, we did a pretty good haul with like trying to band as many skimmers and terns as we could. So we had overall well over 160 skimmers banded from 2014 through 2018. And then we only had about, I think we had 32 large-billed terns and maybe 15 or 16 yellow-billed terns. And what we're finding is that there were there was a high number of birds nesting in a previous year that returned to nest in the next year. And for skimmers, that was like almost 87% of the individuals that I had banded on nest came back to nest. Same with large-billed terns with 70%. So this kind of hints at that there might be some site fidelity going on, which is kind of counter to what we had anticipated, because we thought that they'd be more, that these guys would not necessarily be connected to habitat because of river flooding and such, and so they would be more flexible in their strategies, but it doesn't look like it. I think they're pretty stuck to their places, because in some areas they were actually going back to the same playas. So it was pretty interesting. So when you're thinking about animal movements, obviously you realize that there's the internal dialogue between the environment and the animal. And while we can't really get at the animal internal state, we can get an idea of what the environment is and just kind of guess at it. But what this means is that it's really critical to understand life history strategies of the animal in question, especially in relation to movement responses, because we want to know how skimmers mitigate pressures on reproduction, because that's going to tell us how they'll respond to other pressure or other issues, such as disturbance or habitat fragmentation, or even just habitat loss. So instead of just doing skimmers, though, I think we should look at all three species. So we have the yellow-billed tern, the large-billed tern, and the skimmers themselves. It's really interesting because, especially in Manu, these birds have to account for extreme amounts of predation threat, flood threat, thermoregulatory threat, and then there's obviously, high variability within these threats. And so there's a lot of variation that gets thrown at them on a yearly basis. I guess we, in order to really kind of look at this, we kind of had to go back to the very beginning and ask ourselves, do skimmers actively choose nesting sites? And well, according to the North American data, and also what Zarza did in Brazil, it does seem like that there is a preference for particular places, as well as some degree of nest site fidelity or colony site fidelity. But sometimes it's not very high. Like you can have 0.5, but then you can have 0.3, and along the east coast of North America, fidelity, it is so variable from like a 0.3 to a 0.7 that you just, and that changes from year to year. But one thing we do know about Manu, and especially from Martin's data, is that they seem to prefer wider beaches when that is available to them. And again, like I said, individuals at Manu are breeding again and again and again. In fact, I want to point out we have a pair that the female was first banded in 2012, and we subsequently banded her mate Billy in, 2000? I think Billy got banded in 2016, and so they're still hanging out together. They're still on the same at Trans Manu, same playa, and have been paired up for, gosh, yeah, well, 2006 years, and who knows, they probably are still paired up. We'll have to see it when we go back. So the thing is, though, is that you have to really, aside from like whether or not there's nest sites, active nest site selection, you also have to think about, factors that influence nest choice. So obviously a big one is predation threat, because you want a place that's safe for both adults and nest contents. But you also want appropriateness of the location. Is it a microclimate? And what I mean by a microclimate is it, can you thermoregulate the eggs properly? What's the flood threat and everything? But then you also have to think about, is there enough food nearby to sustain adults and offspring? So when it comes to predation threat, avian nest failure, the predation threat is the number one cause of avian nest failure, and it's an important source of adult mortality. And in Manu, predation accounts for up to 87% of nest failure. So it's a pretty important aspect to what's going on in Manu. And obviously, if we want natural selection, should favor individuals that choose nest sites that reduce predation risk, right? Then you got flood threat, which obviously is caused by precipitation, and then that could be freon haze and other storms. But it's typically temporary, 2 to 7 days, depending on quantity of rainfall and the number of rainfall events. But in some years, it can be particularly important for ground nesting species, causing upwards of 47% of nest loss. And then, of course, as the season progresses, you got thermoregulatory threats, because the ambient sand temperatures can reach greater than 71 degrees Celsius. And for those of us who are on the Fahrenheit scale, that's greater than 160 degrees. And that's crazy to think about, because lethal temperatures for embryo and chick growth is literally 15 minutes at temperatures greater than 29 degrees Celsius are going to cause lethal effects. And so I took this little piece from Martin's study, show you that the temperature that can be achieved by abandoned nests versus actively incubated nests. And you can see there's a radical difference. They are able to keep it within 2 to 3 degrees. And that's what allows them to be able to have successful nests. Able to stay on nests and incubate properly without too much disturbance, they can do a really good job of keeping these eggs, incubating and developing. And again, on this though, when you're thinking about natural selection, it should favor individuals that choose nesting locations that are appropriate for microclimates. And you'll understand in a little bit why I keep harping about natural selection. So the last but not least, of course, is food availability, because when birds are nesting, they're constrained to be central place foragers. So they have to return to that central location of the nest to care for their offsprings. And terns and skimmers are semi-precocial, so the first few weeks, the chicks are really dependent on their parents to provision them with food. So in that case, you would want to be able to actively select breeding locations that are near foraging grounds too, because if you can reduce your energetic costs and increase the fitness of your offspring, well, that's what you would want to see for natural selection. Reduce impacts to reproductive success. But the problem is that there's a lot of conflicting factors, that all of these influences can conflict with another one. And it's any one year, one could be more important than the other. So most of the time, predation is pretty high, but flooding can be quite variable depending on, just the seasonality of the precipitation. Thermoregulation goes with flooding, that it'll be dependent upon precipitation and such that in some years heat won't be a problem. And then food availability can be also influenced by flooding issues, because if there's severe flooding, food availability nearby the nesting sites would not be there. So you can see it is quite a complicated picture. So some of the ways in which we think about how should water birds mitigate selective pressures. Well, I mean, the big one obviously is doing active nest site selection. And then, if you have a short period of development for your eggs and such, you can do repeated clutch attempts. But you could also, behaviorally, you could decrease your incubation bouts, which what I mean is the total length of incubation. And if you can concentrate your incubation and shorten it, that would free you up to be able to get to the next stage of reproduction. You could also, if you can't do anything and you're constrained with your incubation rates, what you could do then as a bird is you can increase your provisioning rates to your chicks, how much time you feed the chicks, and correspond with increased growth rates of the chicks. If food availability is not limited, then the only thing that's going to constrain that chick growth is actually the physiological capability of the chick to grow. So that might be another aspect that there might be some variation in. But you can, and then also last but not least is that breeding location fidelity might be present. And why that's important is like if you already know the location, you already know the predation threats, you have an idea of the river threats, you know where you're breeding and you know what it's like, and that familiarity breeds higher success rates for being able to reproduce there. So, do they have active nest site selection? A short answer is yes. And so I'm seeing it in all three species that we looked at, that these birds are preferring to be closer to the water's edge and farther from the forest edge. And that's mainly because predation is really the biggest driver. And so they're going to stay away from the forest edge. But they also select wider beaches when the pliostructure provides that option. But there's also another reason why they want to be closer to the water, and that is because it reduces their thermoregulatory threat, because if they're closer to the water, they can get off the nest, jump down to the water, and then come back to the nest quicker than if they were higher up on the beach. If you're looking at the graphic, obviously, BLSK is black skimmer, LBTE is large-billed tern, and YBTE is yellow-billed tern. And so this is distance in meters. So moving on, some of the other life history parameters of the managed skimmers that I was looking at was obviously incubation of the eggs. So we found that egg incubation only takes about, give or take, 20 days. And these nest reliefs where adults are passing off and relieving each other, they're about 6 to 12 exchanges per hour, and that depends on the season, the where you are in the season. So like there's more exchanges in, say, late September versus like early July. And then chick provisioning is 3 to 5 fish per young per hour. And interestingly, time to fledge is about 25 days, with chicks reaching 90% of their weight within 20 days of hatching. And what I mean by 90% of weight is just like that's a point at which they can fledge. So within 20 days or around 20 days, they're capable of fledging. But you're like, okay, we got that information, but how do we measure that? How do we figure out how important it is? And so I went back through some of the North American literature just to see if there's some comparative information. And what we're finding, I mean, in a nutshell, is that egg incubation period, incubation bouts or nest reliefs, chick fledge periods, provisioning rates, and colony size of the Manu pairs are all different from North American populations. So that, and what I mean about like colony size is typically in Manu, there's 1 to 2 breeding pairs per kilometer of beach. Whereas in North America, you can have 25 to 1,000 breeding pairs in this literally a hectare of beach. So as you see, there's quite a bit of difference. And I really think that this has to do with predation driving this this reduction in colony size for the skimmers. So, you think about that, it's like, okay, we got some differences in their life history parameters, but really, what does that mean? And well, I mean, so 2 of the points that have kind of come away from it with it on this is that one, that clearly, the skimmers in Manu are getting through the nesting cycle faster than coastal populations. Although they, and it's still even with the influence of flooding. So even though flooding can lengthen the nesting period in Manu, the growth rates and the incubation bouts are shorter. Well, growth rates are faster, the incubation rates are shorter, which means they're getting through the nesting cycle faster. And why this is really of interest is that these shorter nesting periods allow for more nesting opportunities if the nest fails, and this reduction in effort gives you advantages in how they can mitigate impacts to reproductive success. So if you have like a species, if you have skimmers that they nest and it floods out, well, they're going to re-nest. I'm like, okay, and that one might be successful, and then they incubate and they get to a chick stage, and the next step is to get that chick from the chick to fledge as fast as they can to get through predation impacts. And so it really is kind of this race to get through all these different environmental threats. And the interesting thing about this is that, we see these differences in Manu, but in North America, you see similar threats. Predation's an issue, but they have, obviously tidal flooding or spring tides. But that's kind of comparable to having the last high flood of the wet season. So timing is everything. So if the birds figure it out right and they time it right, and they nest they start nesting after the big flood, in either North America or South America, their chances of reproductive success are much higher than if they don't time it properly. So I think what happens in Manu that's different from North American populations is that the North American populations are confounded by urban development and habitat loss and fragmentation and disturbance. And if they want to move somewhere else, they're really constrained. There's no nesting habitat for them to move to. And that's been a big issue that we've been trying to address because skimmer populations in North America are on the decline, especially on the Atlantic coast. And so that's something that we're trying really hard to address, is trying to understand, why they're declining and how we can better conserve these populations and I don't know, minimize the decline or halt the decline. I don't know if that's would even be possible at this point, but we try. So, just to recap, kind of what we've learned is, that these guys, they use river tributaries to navigate across the Amazonian interior. And they're not nomadic breeders. And so they actively return to the same breeding locations year after year. And they really do manage to mitigate impacts to reproductive success through their behaviors. And that includes, active nest site selection and, and behavioral changes in life history parameters such as incubation bouts and, provisioning of chicks. So, and then of course, the last part is just that, we've documented a sizable population of skimmers crossing the Andean cordillera to winter along the Peruvian coast. So was not a rare instance of what happened in 2014. I think a lot of them do it and we just haven't been able to document it. So, and that opens up, a big question of how do they do it? How are they capable of doing it? And so who knows, maybe I'm still continuing working on that. So sort of some of the things that I'm working on that I want to continue with is obviously more band resites information, looking at survival rates. I don't quite have enough to say, what the survival rates for the Manu breeding skimmers are. But I also want to continue tracking skimmers and terns using GPS telemetry so we can get some more information on these very diverse strategies and how they connect up with other skimmer populations, within the Amazon. And one thing that we're actually moving forward already with is using molecular methods to understand tern and skimmer population connectivity. So I'm working with Patty Seeks at Eastern Connecticut State University, and Patty has been working on layered genetics for many, many years. She's most known for her roseate tern research. And so we are working right now on trying to connect the North American populations of skimmers, but we also want to obviously do a latitudinal component and add to it so we can get this like nice south to north or north to south kind of connectivity to understand how unique these populations are, you know, and the limits to them. And the other thing too, I think, is that we need to, you know, continue comparing, yeah, obviously finding out what other populations in the Amazon are doing. But last but not, and definitely not least though, is like I've got a lot of guesswork with food availability, but to be perfectly honest, it was just too complicated to really do some fish research. So I'm hoping that there's somebody out there who wants to really take up that banner of fish research so that we can, you know, really figure out like what's going on with the fish availability, food availability for these playa nesting species. So I just want to end this with like thanking a lot of people, but mostly, well, not mostly, but a lot of people like that. Most of my funding came through the George Sutton Scholarship at OU. And I wanted to thank obviously Doctors John Terborg, Lisa Davenport, and Dr. Tor Haugesson for their support and inspiration. You know, without those guys, without Lisa, I wouldn't even know the skimmers actually nested in the Amazon. And then I also like to thank the San Diego Zoo Global, the Coach Cashew Biological Station staff, and obviously the Manu National Park Rangers, who were very accommodating, very interested in the work that we're doing. And then obviously there were many, many others who've been helpful to the project that are probably too many to name. And then, you know, my deepest thanks to my field crews of 2017 and 2018. You know, without those guys, and I did put them through the ringer, but without them, I would not have been able to collect as much information as I did and to figure out some of the things that I have about the terns and skimmers in Manu. All right, so Victor, I think that's good for me.
Yeah, that was awesome, Kate. Thank you so much. Reminds me a lot of the field season in the Amazon rainforest. I wish to be there now.
Yeah, me too. I really do miss it.
Yeah, that's so great. So now we want to start to the questions. Ximena Alba, you can help me with that to read it?
Yeah, Victor. Okay. So the first question is from Karen Lau, who asked, how long can a band last? Sometimes seawater or changing environments can affect the visibility of the coats.
That's very true. The plastic coats that I use are of a 5mm PPE plastic that we've documented the last upwards of 7 years. So it just, but you're right, the salt water can wreak havoc, especially with the thinner plastics. So I kind of chose a thicker plastic to work with.
Okay, thank you. Maria Seminario Rebolledo asked, is there a relationship between the characteristics of vegetation, temperature, and the places that the skimmers choose during their migration route?
Well, the only thing that we have been able to determine about like the migration route is that they do seem to follow the river tributaries and they go through the river valleys. So one of the main places that we know they go through is Lake Junin, the Junin region, to get to the coast. And it's that wide, high altitude river valley that they're able to follow. And a lot of this, you know, is migration at night. So it's one of those things, if you really have to have like GPS or other sorts of satellite telemetry to be able to track this and track them as they go. We suspect that there's many more places that they can cross over. We just haven't found them all. And it doesn't seem like there is like a vegetative characteristic, but for like structure of it, they do prefer like more shallow kind of riverways. They don't really prefer fast water, although they will come down to the Rio Alto Madre, down to the Rio Madre de Dios and cross and go up to the Ucayali, but again, that's just, we've only got a few individuals that we're working really hard to get more funds to continue tracking them.
Okay, great, thank you. Maria Fernanda Rabanalche León asked, which are the natural predators of the skimmers?
Well, for adult skimmers, honestly, there aren't very many, but we've documented black caracaras taking the eggs. There are also the iguanas. We've had, I want to say jacaranda that have taken them. But as far as like avian predators, most of the larger owls, most of the larger eagles could take an adult skimmer.
Thank you. Romina Najarro Flores says, hi, Kate, thank you for the talk. How can predation be measured for skimmers chicks in the US and in Manu? Are there different methods for the Amazon and the US?
For predation? Usually what it is when we measure predation, we're doing weekly nest checks or daily nest checks. And what'll happen is, like, for looking at nest success, we'll look for particular characteristics that we define as predation, whether that's cracked eggshells or liquid from the yolk or whatnot that we can identify as being a predator. And those same techniques are used both in Manu and in North America. So it's been pretty good about that. The other way we've also kind of looked at predation in North America is to do camera trapping. And that's been quite successful in several colonies. The problem with Manu is just it's a matter of logistics, and it's definitely something that could be done in the future. We just at the point in time that I was down there, I was very limited in what I could do, and I was time limited. But yeah, I would love to explore that more.
Okay, thank you. Maria Seminario asked, is the nesting fidelity of the skimmers their own characteristic, and why is this?
So I think that it's not really, it can be a characteristic of most ground nesting species. I say this with a caveat because sometimes it's species specific. But for skimmers, they have a range. So depending on where they are and what their influences on their reproduction are, it depends on their site fidelity. So if they have a year in, like, say they're in New York State and they have a year where they have heavy predation, they will actually abandon and they will move to another colony the next year. Where down in Manu, what we've seen is that they stay in Manu, but they'll move down a playa or two, but they don't stray very far from where they originally attempted to nest. And I don't think that predation on the adults is as high as nest predation is in Manu. Nest predation seems to be the most important influence rather than adult mortality.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask you one of my own questions,
Sure.
Which is, I wonder if the skimmers that did the Trans-Andes migration did it alone, or it was like a small group of skimmers that did the Trans-Andean migration?
We suspect that it's small groups. I've seen groups of skimmers go through Atalaya and upriver in groups of 18 to 30. So I think they do it. I don't think they do it alone. I think they do it in groups. And I think they also actually do it in groups of adults and juveniles, because we've seen both adults and juveniles along the Peruvian coast, like in Paracas and such.
Okay. I also wonder if the difference that are seen between the population of skimmers in the US and in South America were like significant difference for the species to split up, or there were only small behavioral differences?
No, there are morphological differences in the between the two populations. So they're definitely different, but we haven't done any molecular work yet to figure out just how different, if they're really different species. But it would make sense that they would change. I know for a fact that they're a whole lot larger than the skimmers in North America. So we have, on average, the males the smallest population I've been able to measure are the New York State birds, and they have a wing chord of 300 and on average about 390 millimeters. And in Manu, I was generally, I think the average size we had for Manu wing chords for the males were 415 millimeters. So it's just a matter of millimeters, but it is interesting that they are larger.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, for what I know, for the smaller morphological differences, some species have been like separated. So maybe, I mean, if you could do the genetic analysis, that will be like very interesting to see.
Well, hopefully that will be happening in the next year or so, just depending on how things go with our pandemic, you know.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for your talk. It was really amazing. It was really inspiring, at least for me. And if someone else has any question, you can like write it in the chat, or you can ask to turn on the microphone if you like. Let's give them a few minutes. Oh, I don't know if maybe Victor, do you have like
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay. I read it about in the Transandine migration. They can stay like in lakes, like in Bolivia. When they went to Bolivia, they can keep in Bolivia a little time. That do you think that is possible here? Maybe when you have a data, they cross to the Andes for Junin, right?
Right.
So
Oh, yeah.
they can maybe stay a little time in the lakes in Peru, in
Oh, yeah, for sure.
the Andes, and think it is
Yeah.
possible.
Well, you gotta realize that, you know, to go from say 200 meters above sea level to suddenly, you know, 4,500 meters of sea level in such a short distance, like, you know, it's less than 600 kilometers. So that's like a steep, you know, incline. And I'm sure that puts a lot of pressure on the birds, both energetically and such that, you know, it would be nothing for them to spend a day or two or even three recovering if there's food available for them to be there. I mean, and it would seem like Lake Cunin would have some food for them. But, you know, in other areas, we see them in the river mouses. They're going down, migrating down south to Chile. They do the same thing. They kind of hang out for a few days, like at the river mouths, and then they'll go on. So because skimmers do have basically a feed and flight kind of ecology. So they don't like a lot of shorebirds. They will, you know, feed and they will just, you know, gorge themselves and then fly nonstop. Yeah, these guys don't. They don't have, you know, any constraints on them. They're not nesting. They don't have to get anywhere. So it's just easy enough just to like go, okay, this is a good spot. I'm tired. I need some food, and just kind of rest and keep going. So it's entirely possible that they would, you know, hang out on some of these lakes for a while.
Yeah, and also, are you considered maybe take a sample for studying the mercury? Maybe they can translate this mercury and other populations.
Yeah, so I'm not involved in the mercury stuff, so first per se, but I do believe that Stanford has been. I mean, we've provided samples, feather samples to Stanford. I have not heard back about the research, what the results were, but I always assume that they would be, because they do eat the fish in Manu and in other rivers, that they would be a transfer point for mercury contamination further through some of the rivers and lakes in the Amazon. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much. I think we have more questions. Karen Lau. Yeah, she asked one last question. Has the GPS equipment were recovered? How small were they are in the avoid disturbing birds? Thank you so much for the talk.
So we actually used PTTs for the satellite tracking, and those were actually 5 grams, and I think they weighed about 6.5 with the harness attachment that we used. And they're solar powered, so that was nice because you could extend tracking for a long period of time. But what I'd like to do are using GPS trackers, which actually you can get trackers that are as light as 2.3 grams right now.
Okay, that's good. That's great. Well, thank you, Kate, again for the awesome talk, and I think this is going to be inspiring for everyone here.
Oh, no. Well, thanks for asking me. And it was a pleasure to catch up again. You know, I was like looking on and I was seeing a lot of familiar names and I'm like, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Reconnect.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Too. We can touch with for the next webinar. And thank you.